CLI. Okay, let's get the acronym out of the way first. And to that, I'm going to go to Google and say, hey, Google, what do you think about CLI? Google comes back and says, oh, I know about this CLI Engage thing. And I see, oh, Children's Learning Institute. Well, I know what children are, and I know what learning means, and I know what an institute is, so I can probably piece together something from that, certainly enough to say that that is not the context that I'm interested in at the moment. But again, you'll find CLI used in a lot of different contexts. We're interested in something more technical, and I noticed a hit down here that says Common Language Infrastructure. That's a common technical definition of CLI. I shouldn't say definition, a common use of the acronym CLI. But not in the context that we're looking at today. Instead, what we're interested in, and by we I mean you, is command line interface, CLI. You will also, by the way, catch me calling this a command line interpreter. So it really depends upon whether I'm interested in how it does what it does. It's a translator and interpreter, or am I interested in saying what it is? It's an interface. Let's see. Command, let's one word at a time. Command, there are certain instructions that the thing knows. We can type an instruction into it, and then it will try to translate that into something the processor can handle and carry it out, execute it. Line is the idea that there is a special key on your keyboard, the Enter key, and that designates the end of a line. We'll talk about physical lines and logical lines at some point, but for now, the command line interpreter or command line interface is especially interested in that Enter key to say, okay, now I should stop listening and try to translate and execute what I've been told to that point. And interface is the prefix inter means between, facials, sides kind of thing. So there's two sides that this CLI is sitting in between. And one side is the machine, the computer, and the other side is the user, which is you and I in this case. And as an interpreter, it also sits between two sides of a conversation. And if we think about how an interpreter works in more conventional everyday life, you might think of a sign language interpreter for some event. You might think of watching the news and there's reporters interviewing a foreign correspondent or something. And anyhow, an interpreter in that context is taking a little bit of a conversation and then mentally translating that into another language and then echoing or spitting that out in the other language. And then they go right back and get another chunk and do it again, over and over and over. And so that's what our command line interpreter is doing between us and the machine, is it's going to listen for a little bit, signified by that Enter key, and then translate it and execute it. Okay, enough of my talking about it. Let's see. I'm using Windows. I'm assuming most of you are using Windows. I'll show you in a Linux environment as well, though, because one thing I really want to stress is that command line interpreters have a lot in common, regardless as to which one it is and which operating system it's on. So I'm going to begin with CMD. Oh, I didn't want to do that, actually, because you might not have that shortcut there. So I'm going to start typing in command, and it's going to come back with command prompt. Okay, so I'll click on that, I'll select that one, and what we see is a prompt. So all CLIs have something, and the point of it is to let you know where the beginning of a line is. We all know lines have 2 points and two endpoints. It's a path between them kind of thing. So what we're seeing here is the beginning of the line, the beginning endpoint of our command line is a prompt. And it can be configured to show all kinds of different things. But the standard prompt that I'm getting, I believe is pretty standard on this machine, is showing me a path in a file system. And you're like, okay, great, why? And that is because CLIs are file-centric or file-focused, file-oriented, if you want it that way. And by file, I really should say file system. Which we can elaborate more on in the future. But essentially what I see here is it's showing me, oh, this is my C: hard drive, my Windows storage device. And then on the root of that storage device, that backslash, that beginning backslash, makes it an absolute path, meaning absolute from some storage device. There is a folder called users. And then there's another slash separating folder and file names. And so inside of the users folder, there should be a subfolder called Joe. And that is the CLI's notion of where it currently is in the file system. And again, I can't emphasize how important that is. Maybe at this point, it might be instructive to say, well, what if I came over here and I went to Windows and I started typing in power? Because Windows PowerShell is the newer version of their CLI. If Microsoft had their way, they would probably pretend that CMD or command prompt never existed, and PowerShell was the only thing, but you can't undo history. And so I'm in PowerShell. Again, what we see here is it starts with a PS for PowerShell, but again, it's showing me a path in the prompt, and it happens to be the same path. If I come over here and I happen to have the Windows subsystem for Linux installed, WSL installed, and I have a shortcut to that here. Again, that's something for another video, but essentially I now have a bash prompt. And yes, so bash is the shell, the default shell in most Linux systems. In Windows, you probably pretty much have the choice between CMD and PowerShell. In the Linux world, there are a ton of shells, and I have no desire or interest to get into shell wars about, oh, my shell's better than yours. Again, everything that I'm doing here is pretty common to most shells. And as I said, bash is the de facto standard shell in GNU Linux systems. Okay. Okay. What I see here is a prompt again. So this time Linux, this is an Ubuntu distribution of a GNU Linux system. Again, more on that to come in another video. But what it's showing me is my username, Joe, at my machine name. Okay, and so this is my Windows computer name, colon, the tilde, which is a shortcut for the user's home directory. Again, bear with me on that. And then the $sign, which is the character ending the prompt, much like the greater than sign is in CMD command or Windows PowerShell. Okay, so here we are, 3 different shells, all have a prompt, and all of them are going to suck in some number of characters until I hit enter. So type in some characters here, I type in some characters here, and again, none of them have done anything until I hit enter. So over here on GNU Linux, I'm going to hit enter, and it comes back and it says, hey, VAUOV was not a command that it knew, that it could find. It didn't know the command internally, and it couldn't find it. Those are 2 separate important things that we're going to elaborate on in this video. Let me come back up here first and do the same thing here. We get a little more verbose description, but it's saying CDUWIEI, exactly what I typed in. The term that is not recognized as the name of a commandlet, function, script file, operable program. Okay. Again, a bunch of stuff there, but essentially by saying commandlet or function or script file, it's saying I don't recognize that command internally to me. I've never been taught that, and it couldn't find an operable program with that name. Getting a little bit ahead, but let me come over here to CMD. Same thing. Essentially, a little bit different error message, but It's spitting back what I typed in and saying it is not recognized as an internal or external command, operable program, or batch file.